Hello and welcome. I am Dr. Lara, a clinical pharmacist specializing in functional medicine, as well as a certified yoga teacher and Reiki master. I run a truly integrative health coaching practice encompassing functional medicine lab testing, yoga and meditation, and a sprinkling of Reiki energy medicine. Join me here on Light Body Radio to break through your health plateau and come into alignment with your natural vitality. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Light Body Radio. I am your host, Dr. Lara, and today we have back with us David Krantz, our resident certified coach specializing in epigenetics and personalized nutrition and everything nutrigenomics and nutrigenetics. So welcome back.
Thanks, Laura. It's great to be back again. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
I love, our conversations are just, I feel like really unique. And so I really appreciate them. So thank you. So today we're actually going to talk about how genetically informed nutrition and biohacking practices intersect with shadow work, emotional healing, and somatic awareness. So I'm really excited about this because I think it does actually sort of bring some sort of unity to all of the little different things that we talk about. And I love your approach here and how you're trying to bring it all full circle and really integrate some things for some, what I feel like is real tangible change that people can see and relate to. So let's start with what is shadow work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I appreciate that. And, I feel like that's why I've been moving in this direction more and more in terms of just trying to integrate different aspects of what it means to be a human. The physiological and, nutrition and all of that stuff is important, but there's a whole other side to what it means to change and transform and become, who you really want to be and who you're meant to be in a way. And so, that's where this conversation, I'm excited to take it. And, I think to put a definition on what we're talking about here, I look at shadow work as being able to reclaim parts of the self that we've previously rejected or made bad or, relegated to parts of the psyche, parts of the self that we've relegated away from what's visible, what's seen, what's allowable. And there's a lot of reasons for why that happens, and we can get into that, but it allows you to be a more whole person in terms of being able to accept and embrace all of who you are. And I think that's a deep part of, the healing process and the process of growing and really becoming the totality of, yourself. And those are big concepts. And I know it's kind of a big thing to start out with, but we'll dive in a little bit further
what is
there.
That? What is the totality of myself?
Yeah.
For sure. And in 2020, before the pandemic, I picked a word of the year, flow. And I didn't realize how poignant that was going to be or challenging that was going to be for that year. And so this year I chose the word awareness for 2021. And so I think this aspect and concept of shadow work really accentuates that, because I think one of the biggest steps, and you touched on a little bit, is just the awareness that we have a shadow. And especially in the self-help world and maybe even the holistic healing world, we talk about a lot of manifestation things and focus on the positive, and all that is good, but that can only take you so far. And this is part of the work that I've been doing on a personal level as well, is like, okay, I get the law of attraction. I get that. But then there's still these other things that are like sort of tugging on you in the other direction. And also too, from the energetic perspective of we're energetic beings on this earth that is an earth of polarity, meaning good, bad, light, dark, opposites. And so I think shadow work has to be an integral part of that. You can't just literally be in rainbows and sunshine all the time on planet Earth. And so I feel, like the shadow, we have to say, okay, what is that? What is that part of myself that I have sort of decided to stop looking at and even acknowledge? And from what I was reading too, which I think is really important to point out, is that sometimes that's even positive aspects of ourselves or like really positive traits that either someone has told us are not good, or in some way, shape, or form, we had an experience that made us or encouraged us to choose something different instead of acknowledging that. So can you talk about that a little bit, about how even the shadow work can bring light to the good parts of ourselves that we've decided to deny?
Yes, absolutely. I love that you're pointing that out already, because that's one of the kind of hidden gems of the shadow. Is it contains both positive and negative material. The shadow, you can think of it as something that is kind of blacked out or hidden from view. And that doesn't mean that the stuff in there is quote unquote bad. It just means that it's not accessible to the conscious mind because we've decided that it's not safe, or it's not societally acceptable, or it's not good for us to, embody those characteristics or traits that inherently are a part of us. And a good example of that might be is a little kid getting told, you talk too much. And then saying, oh, it's bad when I talk too much, but maybe you actually have a real gift for language and articulating things, and rediscovering that part of yourself might actually unlock aspects that of yourself you were previously unaware of and had sort of put away because that was the messaging you got. And I think the other thing to kind of address here too is the subjective notion of good and bad. That's a very relative kind of thing. And we oftentimes, what we perceive as bad or shameful, it is really just kind of an opinion that doesn't carry weight when you shine the light at it. And you see oftentimes that it's something that it only has power because you're giving it power by keeping it in the dark, right? And it's like one of those things where often giving it meaning, right? And maybe another thing to mention here too is that when we're talking about the psyche, we're talking about both this on an individual level and also on a collective human level. And each of our individual psyches makes up the sum total of the collective psyche. And so there's not just individual shadows, our own personal material we're dealing with. There's also cultural shadows, ancestral shadows. And we live those stories out through our personal shadows. But, I think a deep aspect of healing as a species, right? If we zoom out a little bit and just look at this on the global level, like the individual healing work contributes to the larger whole. And a lot of what we're dealing with right now as a species and culture is the collective shadow of our ancestors that is being transmitted through culture. If you look at things like sexism and racism and genocide, violence, all of these things, these kind of whispers of the past in a way that continue repeating themselves in our heads, kind of unconsciously, undoing that within ourselves is contributing to a much larger frame of how we relate to, the shadow and that. And that being said, I want to touch back just for a second in terms of what you were saying about, maybe personal growth culture or kind of love and light culture, just around like only focusing on the positive, only the kind of inverted messaging of whatever you focus on, you're going to get. Just because you focus on the parts of yourself that are shameful or quote unquote dark or bad, doesn't mean you're going to attract that to yourself. That just means you're going to be able to have a better understanding of your tendencies and have more agency and choice over where you exercise and utilize those traits, right? Because if we are not aware, like you said, thinking that's just pure awareness, if we're not aware that, say, I have a tendency to get triggered and angry when I feel rejected, for example, and that can show up in a number of different areas. If I don't deeply understand and address the part of myself that feels that rejection, understand where that comes from, understand that disconnection, I'm going to just be led around by that part of myself like a dog on a leash and have no idea why I'm being led there because I can't actually understand why this is happening over and over again. And so one of the key indicators of needing to do shadow work, which we all need to do. Let's just address that also from the start. This is not something that is unique to any one person and someone it's like a bad thing to need to do. No, this is part of the growth process. This is part of, I think, a mature spirituality, if we're talking about it in that terms. If you're not able to understand and be aware and work with those parts, those patterns keep repeating. And so that's a great indicator to start looking at some of these things. If you find yourself repeating patterns and can't understand why, finding yourself in the same situation, maybe the same relationship dynamic, maybe that shows up with a partner or a boss or a friend, and you're like, oh, I thought if I just found a different person to be in relationship with, this stuff would go away. Because usually what happens with shadow work that's not done, and I don't even want to use that because it's an ongoing process. It's never really done. But it usually what happens when there's that material that is kind of driving us is we tend to see that in other people and blame other people.
Yeah, or we blame Mercury in retrograde.
Right.
We blame something outside of ourselves that, again, like we're in essence giving our power away, because we're saying, well, it's not me, it's that or them. And then therefore I don't have power over it. And really, which I think is what is so exciting about this work, is that it does empower you. So at times it can be uncomfortable, and maybe, and that's, really why we shy away from it, because we don't want to feel uncomfortable. We want to feel good. But again, like you said, like just because we're bringing light to it and we're focusing on it for a short amount of time does not mean that you are going to attract more. The whole point, actually, for me, from my perspective, is transmutation. So we bring light, we shine light, we have some expanded awareness about the pattern, maybe about a situation where we were victimized, we weren't in control, but that formed so many opinions and patterns, and that all you do is bring awareness to it, and now you can choose again. And when you're given that opportunity for that pattern again, you can say, no. Or, like, I'm going to approach this differently. I'm going to look at it differently. And again, you've talked about shame already a little bit. And I definitely want to say that shame is one of those subjective perceptions, because that is something that you can definitely choose to reframe. And so you don't have to feel bad about it. And I like to use the little rhymey phrase, objective detective, when I'm talking about any of this stuff. It's like, look at it with curiosity and objectivity, and understand that just because you've been told something or you've convinced yourself of something doesn't mean it necessarily will be that always. So yeah, I think this gives us a lot of opportunities to totally change and transmute so many cultural wounds, familial, personal, all that stuff. It's so powerful. Yes. And we all need to do it. And I like that you said spiritual maturity too. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I want to touch on two things there. And the first being the idea around taking responsibility for some of our own contributions to the situations we find ourselves in. And I think that there's a delicate balance between really being able to recognize what I as an individual am contributing to, and what is, maybe a larger cultural shadow that I'm interacting with. Right. And so I think it's important to say that this is not like a blanket, you create your own reality and have control over all of it type perspective. This is this is more of the complexity between, there are many things that you do have control over, and there are actually some things that as an individual you don't have control over. And being able to parse those out and understand them is really what allows you to choose which things you want to focus on, what boundaries you want to be able to set within those larger systems that maybe, we don't have immediate impact on. And I think it's just important to kind of look at areas where it's helpful to take more responsibility, and then areas in some cases where it's helpful to say, you know what, this actually isn't really my fault. And I am actually in relationship to a larger system that might be causing problems in my life in certain ways. And so I just want to kind of look at that as a balance where
Absolutely.
It's healthy to take responsibility for the individual shadow, and it can be taxing and unhealthy to take more than one's fair share of the collective shadow and feel like it's your fault.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you. Yes, because there's for sure. And I don't know if it's necessarily more in women than men, but I feel like, because a lot of what we're talking about too can also be when we talk about culture, our gender roles that have definitely been taught to us in large part, and the whole archetype of the mother and the female taking responsibility for familial things, and then therefore that translates out into so many different things. So yes, thank you for bringing that forward for sure. Okay, I want to transition quickly since we're still talking about a framework here. Somatic awareness. What is that? Because I'm not sure a lot of people really understand like what that is. I think we're exposed to it, but it's not talked about in that way. So
yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad you transitioned. That was actually going to be the second thing I wanted to bring up, and use what you're talking about around shame, as maybe a jumping off point to talk about a little bit, because shame, if we're talking about it, is not actually just a thought pattern. It's an affective pattern, meaning it's affect. It's held in the body. It's actually something that when you feel shame, and there's good research behind this, you actually change your posture, you change certain hormone signaling in the body, you change, there's a whole cascade of physiological things that go with the emotion feeling of shame. And what somatic awareness is referring to is really the feelings in the body, the internal felt awareness of the body. And like the scientific word for this is also called interoception, or being like, aware of what's happening in your body. And so, if you're listening right now, you can experience this by just saying to yourself, I'm going to focus my attention on the tips of my fingers just for a moment, and just really, see what the tips of my fingers feel like right now. And, maybe they're a little tingly, maybe they're cold, maybe they're hot. It's that sense of just being aware of the actual sensations in your body. That's a type of somatic awareness. And the reason why this is so important in shadow work and in any type of emotional work is that these patterns, these thoughts, the experiences that go into creating the shadow aren't just mental constructs. They are also feelings, and the kind of sum total of the way that we hold our body and our posture and our gut feelings. Like if you have ever had the experience of getting nervous before having to do public speaking, or going on a date or whatever it is, that there's some physical sensations that come up in the body when there's strong emotions, and those are critical indicators to learn what they are for you. And they're amazing entry points into being able to shift and change these patterns, because what's become pretty apparent in the psychotherapy world over, I'd say the past 20, 30 years is talk therapy alone only goes so far. Just talking about something and keeping it in the mental sphere works for some things, but then, oftentimes what's needed is to really engage with the feelings of the body and stick with them and move through them. And this is a really strange process. If you've never done this before, it sounds very abstract. It sounds very kind of untouchable in a way if you haven't felt this for yourself. And that's also not uncommon, because like you said, in culture, we're not taught that this is a capacity that we even have to engage with our emotions and ourselves in this way. This is something that most people come to after they've experienced trauma, or they've realized, hey, this thing just isn't working for me anymore, and I'm feeling really depressed or anxious. And then that's the signals from the body to say, all right, you got to start paying attention to these somatic signals. And so there are ways to, say, integrate the awareness of, hey, I've got this pattern. I can kind of, figure out where it came from. Like, just to use the example again, maybe I felt a lot of shame when I was told that I talked too much as a kid and that I should be quiet and mind my own business, and, children should be seen, not heard, or whatever the story is. And that's great to get that awareness. But oftentimes the next layer to truly starting to do the healing work is to connect with the bodily sensations associated with those memories,
right,
associated with those patterns, and begin to consciously shift the somatic associations that we have with those memories or parts of our shadow. And, shining the light on the shadow is both a mental process, like, becoming aware of it. And then a lot of the times what tends to stabilize it is really living it and embodying it in the body in a way that gives it permission to breathe or exist. All of a sudden it's like you're constantly told not to do something, not to do something, not to do something. And then you're like, oh yeah, maybe you can do it. You're like, really? Maybe I don't know. There's a hesitancy,
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a stabilization process that somatic work really tends to be helpful for, especially when there's trauma, especially when there's heightened nervous system activation that prevents us from accessing things that don't feel safe or don't feel like it's okay.
Yeah, I think so many of us are taught as children to dissociate with our feelings, get a tough skin, or don't show them how you feel, don't show them that they hurt your feelings, or I guess kind of a self-protection mechanism, even though I think ultimately it does more harm than good in the long run, in terms of, again, just the unification with being in our bodies, because ultimately what it teaches us to do is ignore what our body is telling us. And our body is constantly communicating with us in terms of, like you said, oh, your stomach is nervous before public speaking, or maybe even if it's that, like when your hair stands up on the back of your neck, if you're, in a possibly dangerous situation. So there are some signals that we really should pay attention to and then act on. And so I love that this is, and you're so right in terms of the shadow work, like this is like that next step, and reteaching ourselves that it is okay to be connected and it is okay to respond to these signals that we're getting. And so it's really like almost like a reunification. So we've been taught this dissociation and how to check out. And so now we're like, it's making the conscious choice too, I think, to step back in and be present and say, yes, I am willing to feel these feelings. I'm willing to maybe even feel them without judgment. And again, there's this element of curiosity that comes with the willingness to be aware. And then, and then what? And then the emotional healing? Is that the next? Yay!
Yeah. Well, I'd say this is all intertwined with emotional healing, and first I'll say that this is a skill that is something that you learn over time, and we're not generally taught this as a skill for most of us. Some of us were lucky, but most of us have had to learn it, older. Mm-hmm. And also to touch on what you were saying, I think that's some of the deepest wisdom, is recognizing, the innate wisdom of a lot of how these patterns get formed. They're protective mechanisms. None of the shadow is bad. None of these things that we're doing are wrong. They can be maladaptive over time, but usually when these things are formed, they are adaptive, right? If you are a kid and you're being told, don't use your voice, you might get hit or yelled at if you do. So of course you're going to develop strategies that shape your personality, and then over time, those things no longer become functional, right? It's like in a certain context, in a certain situation, pretty much every time these things form as a result of the psyche trying to protect itself, usually as a kid, and there's no blame there. There's really no shame in that. And I think that that's a key part of it too, is beginning to understand and connect with the deeper, wiser part of your younger self that was trying to do something helpful. Mm-hmm. And that has a major role in emotional healing is beginning to kind of bring those parts back into the fold and say, hey, I see what you were trying to do there. Thank you. Like, genuinely, like, I appreciate the sense of trying to, protect me from whatever was, a threat, perceived threat or real threat. And I think that that's an essential component. And, to zoom it back out for a second into more of a cultural lens, a lot of the vestigial cultural patterns that we're playing out and trying to work through right now are also of the same protective nature, and this is not something I've heard a lot of people talk about. And I think it's actually kind of almost taboo to look at it from this perspective. But I actually think that something like racism has roots in a positive protective mechanism. If you're thinking about thousands of years ago, not knowing, being in small tribes, not knowing who these people were around you, having a very limited worldview, of course it makes sense that our psyches are going to say, someone that looks different than me, gotta keep them out. Those people are bad, they're dangerous. And so the tendency that we have, left, and haven't fully been able to wash out, and maybe never will fully wash out, but maybe we can kind of understand it and overcome it. And like you said, transmute it into something that is healthier.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of these things come from survival. These come from survival mechanisms, traditional gender roles that maybe no longer serve the same function they did when we were hunter-gatherers, or, having to subsistence farm and, have 15 kids just so we could survive. Like,
Mm-hmm.
those are aspects of survival that have imprinted themselves in the human psyche in a way that I find very helpful to look at from a very similar lens on a cultural level, to say, all right, a lot of these things were functional at a certain point, given the context of, a global species now, they don't work. Parts of them don't work. And being able, I think, to acknowledge and look at the roots of it as something that did serve a purpose in human history creates an opening. And I think it creates an ability to say, all right, how do I want to consciously work with this? Similarly to how you might work with the inner child part of yourself that decided to shut down certain parts of your personality so that you could survive, so that you could get the love and attention that you need, and not feel like you were going to be cast out.
Yeah. I think that brings up so many good points that, again, this even, and I referred to it earlier as a world of polarity, but really it's a spectrum of very different, various experiences and experience. But our brain is, and this because you're the psychology expert here. Like, we have like the lizard brain, which is totally focused on keeping us alive. And most of our decisions come from that aspect of the brain. So it takes a very conscious choice, and again, back to awareness, to start to delve into, okay, but if I make this choice, is it really going to kill me? No. Okay. So irrational brain, lizard brain, you can stay over here, and I'm going to play around in the conscious awareness aspect and make some conscious choices. So like you said, like whether that's cultural and ancestral and built into, because I think this is the other thing that's important to point out, is that our brains have formed over millions of years to keep us alive. Like, we are where we are as a species on this earth because of how our brain is developed. And so, again, I think that allows the opening of the door for self-compassion, cultural compassion, and to, instead of judging it as good, bad, then we can, like you said, start to understand it on the spectrum of evolution. And with the choice that we are continuing to evolve, but now maybe we can evolve in a more conscious and aware way instead of just continuing to be in the cycle of our cultural patterns. Now we can say, hey, wait. And I think that's part of our development, our evolution, our growth, and also I think just where we are as a culture all over the world right now. Like, I think we're all sort of like, hey, wait, we don't have to continue this. We can make a different choice, and we can look at what we did in the past And maybe not from such a, like you said, like a place of building walls, but breaking them down and a level of understanding.
Yeah, and I think an important thing to point out there too is in terms of how different parts of the brain are engaged, the use of the frontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that, is conscious, makes decisions, more rationally, can really think through situations. It requires safety. It requires a sense of safety to be able to operate from that place. And when we're not feeling safe, we're going to be, generally more operating from the midbrain and more reptilian parts of the brain that are more survival oriented.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're talking about this, feeling safety is a core component, a underlying component of any of this work, right?
Oh yeah,
If you're still,
yeah.
Yeah, and if you're wondering where your next meal is going to come from, it's pretty much impossible to kind of work with this thing, and so or work in this kind of way, and so we're talking about. And this is also, I'll say, a personal criticism of personal growth culture and things like that I have, is that if we really want to evolve as a species, it's not just about doing our own personal work in terms of deepening our meditation practice or doing shadow work like this. It's helping other people develop and obtain the necessary conditions to start to do that work too. Right. If there's people that are starving and don't have homes and don't have a stable place to live, like, we're just kind of spinning our wheels as a culture if we're only thinking about, what we can do ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so, again, I think that's part of kind of what a mature spirituality looks like. And this is something that I'm, just opening up into myself. So we'll say I'm not standing on a soapbox or saying, anything like I'm better than or anything like that. I'm recognizing this is an issue that I have, that I'm working through, of being able to simultaneously do my own personal work, but then say, all right, how can we empower and enable people who don't have the resources to even think about this stuff to get to a place where this is even possible? So, I think that when we're talking about, again, kind of that interrelationship between individual and collective shadow, there are certain stages or sequences that sort of have to be addressed. Like, okay, once I get to the point where I'm capable of acknowledging my own personal wounds and my own, limitations and things that, I'm healing within myself, what's going to do more good for me to maybe make the next 1 or 2% tweaks to my own psyche, or give someone the opportunity to start to make that first 50% jump into their own healing process. And I think that if we, really look at it on a larger timeline, it's to some degree more about, kind of lifting everyone up at once rather than trying to only do the things for ourselves. And
absolutely.
Like I said, that's, kind of part of my opening to that awareness recently and kind of questioning what my role is in that. So
I think taking responsibility for our role as part of the ecosystem of this planet. And I mean, and again, that's like really big, like, whoa, like, the whole planet, and we're humans and we're on it, but like, what are we doing to help? And what are we, again, taking responsibility for where we're not stepping up or maybe doing harm, and then allowing us to make different choices. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of us are getting there and sort of starting to come out of that purely individualism into more of the, I'm part of a group as a whole, I'm part of a culture as a whole, I'm part of an ecosystem as a whole. Just keep allowing ourselves to see that perspective without becoming overwhelmed by that perspective. Because I think for a lot of us too, that's like, whoa. And maybe with that responsibility, it can become so overwhelming that we're like, no, like that's too much. Like, I don't have that power, or I can't handle all that. And so, like you said earlier, to like knowing when to not take responsibility for all of the things that are not within your control.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a great thing to point out too, is that, engaging with the collective suffering of the world is intense and overwhelming and needs to be titrated, in the right dosage at the right time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's part of what a lot of the personal work prepares us to do, is to start to be able to engage in a broader collective way that doesn't just touch on our own problems and suffering and traumas, but starts to be able to hold space for these larger, ideas and be able to hold some of the grief that's inherent in thinking about that stuff.
Yeah, hold space for the collective healing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. And healing comes often through grief, often comes through the being able to sit through that stuff and really feel it. It's like if you have a loved one die, it's like you have to go through the process of really feeling the emotions through it, where you get stuck. And it's very similar to this type of work when you apply it to a larger, scale. And, I was listening to, and I think this is starting to just seep into the collective here. I was listening to a podcast with Jamie Wheel. I don't know if you're familiar with any of his work, but he's part of a project called the Flow Genome Project, and like big biohacker celebrity kind of guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard him on a podcast that just came out a couple of weeks ago, and they were like, yeah, like the individual biohacking thing is so 2015. Like it's about, we need to figure out how to move from this individual personal optimization to a larger meaning making like ability with a larger frame in mind. And I was just like, that's cool that's what's going on in that world specifically, which very hyper focused on individualism and the sense of like the N of one experiment, which I think is important. I do a lot of that work, but it's like, how do we move and use that as a foundation, as a base, to then begin to think about the interrelatedness of all humans and all of the non-humans that we interact with too, which I think we touched on a little bit in the last conversation as well.
And that is a perfect example of the different levels and aspects of the continuum, again, of the evolution, because you're an expert in epigenetics, and I would even say biohacking. And I would say I am like informed, but not an expert. And then you have those other, what you call like the biohacking celebrities that are the uber experts, and then that they're so in tune with their N of one and their own biohacking that now they're like, okay, but now we need to think bigger, which is true. To me, though, right now, I think personally is that we are still like where you and I are in terms of like getting the word out and educating and opening the eyes and even like helping distribute some resources. And so I want to bring the conversation to this, to the ebook that you sent me that really outlines your approach to sort of bringing this all together for real, tangible change in people's lives, which I think will take them to that next level. So can you tell us a little bit about that and really how it like brings in like the epigenetic aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. So I put together a short ebook, maybe it's about 30 pages or so, 30, 40 pages, that I call Alchemical Wellness Catalyst. And it's really just a little bit of a field guide to the unconscious and to the shadow parts of self, and has some ideas about how to start thinking about that, how to start engaging with it, and has some exercises to do, has some ways of planning wellness goals with that in mind. So like you said, trying to kind of bridge the wellness daily habits and rituals with a sense of how it relates to our sense of self and what it means to be committed to a routine and regimen, and what are the blocks to that? Because a lot of times when we feel stuck, when we feel like we want to do something, but we just kind of keep circling around it and can't quite do it, we want to eat a certain way, and then we, grab the Twinkie, we're like, oh, damn it, I did it again. That's some great shadow material to work with. And so starting to identify that, work with it, somatic awareness exercises in there, that was kind of my hopeful gift in a way when I was thinking like, all right, how can I how can I, just transmit some of this information in a way that might be helpful to people in a broader way?
Yeah. So I think a good example would be, I feel like intermittent fasting is still a hot topic, and for a very good reason, because it has some great effects and it can really transform people's health in a great way. But maybe a good example would be, okay, so maybe someone has struggled with eating disorders. They're wanting to get healthy. They've heard about this intermittent fasting thing. They try it, but then it triggers that shadow aspect of, oh my God, I'm starving, or, oh my God, I'm never going to get food again. Like whatever these, again, like lizard brain thoughts are that are deeply rooted. And so maybe can you like take us through how maybe all this would like come together in an aspect like that? I think helping people discern whether or not a health trend is right for them by, again, tuning into their body and just saying, is this right for me right now? Or do I have some other work to do before I can really explore this thing over here?
Yeah, for sure. And I'll say I'm not an expert on eating disorders, so take that just as a caveat with that example.
I was just using that as an example of a challenge.
Yeah, right. Yeah, yes. But I think that's a good idea, a good point to say like, all right, if there is something that is bringing up a challenge to kind of a core sense of self around like, I'm not feeling good enough, I don't feel skinny enough or pretty enough, and that is something that is overwhelming, that's something that's an overwhelming feeling or sensation. It's a great indicator that there's healing that can be done, and in some cases, I'd use that as more of an extreme example where maybe you actually want to work with someone to do that work. And then there's also maybe less extreme examples where you can start to do some of that work yourself in a safer way. And that's really more what the guide that I put together is for, is to kind of like start to gently nudge at the parts of self that, might keep us stuck. And I think I use this example in the guide itself of like, I'm historically a pretty messy person. Like I will let my space kind of, clutter up, but I know that I work better and I feel better when I have a neat, tidy, organized space. And one of the exercises in the guide is to kind of list out what are the fears related to doing that action. Like, what am I afraid of if I clean my desk? And, one of the things that I identified was like, oh, I would be forced to kind of live up to a higher level of my own potential that I don't know if I really want to, experience. And actually in the guide, you can see there's a list of like 10 fears that would come with that. And so part of that process is sort of saying like, yeah, this is a thing I think I want, but maybe there's a part of me that really fears the growth or fears what it would mean to change part of the way I perceive myself or my identity, or maybe I'm afraid someone will make fun of me for being clean and tidy because that's something I would do to people in school. I was the cool, messy kid who didn't turn in his homework, and the kids that like took all their notes neat, like they were goody two shoe kids, right? So I've like have identified that that's something that I've inverted and turned against myself, which is a limiting factor, right? Exactly. And so it's like starting to parse out those dynamics of judgment and fear. And again, looking at it as not something bad, but something functional, like doing that got my needs met to feel cool and feel, like I was different and unique, and it served a purpose. But left unchecked, that has in certain ways become, problematic, that I am more disorganized than I'd like to be sometimes. So that's just a short example from, kind of a light example from my mind.
Sorry, I took it so deep and so heavy. But no, I love that you've brought it to this place so we can start to wrap it up too, is that this whole process, I think, creates the container for us to look at maybe a place where we'd like to change. So maybe it's like how tidy you keep your space, or to a bigger, like how you approach your food. But it allows you and you take the person through this process of, okay, let's get all my fears out on paper and really look at them and get specific and give them words and labels so they're not as abstract, because I think one of our biggest challenges is just the abstract fear. that we don't really give a name to. And then it just like hangs out and sort of like follows us around and prevents us from moving forward. And then we can look at it and say, again, like, oh, is this something that's true? Is this something that's not true? Is this something that I can reframe? And then what does that look like? And how can I, again, like tune in with my body with that somatic awareness? And then epigenetically, I am less stressed. So my body has less inflammation. I can show up feeling good in a healthier way. And I don't even have to think about all the like little things that are, all the chemical reactions that are happening in my body. But because I'm doing this work, it is innately helping me be healthier and in a better state of mind.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a perfect tie-in back to the epigenetic picture, around what Dr. Mario Martinez calls biocognition. This idea that, it's our experience is kind of the sum total of our thoughts, our feelings, neurotransmitters, hormones, posture, all of these things create this complex, almost like a sphere of, how all these things kind of plug in and relate to each other. And you can influence it from any one of those inputs, right? You can influence your biochemistry through your thoughts or your feelings. You can influence your thoughts or your feelings through changing your biochemistry, with supplements or drugs or whatever, or breath work. What choose your weapon. And I think that's why I still love the biohacking ethos of, you use all the tools at your disposal to be able to start to shift and take control over your biology. But it's like, the biohacking ethos tends to stop at the biology aspect of it. Whereas I think it's really about kind of looking at these more holistic kind of layers of thoughts, feelings, emotions, relationships, expanding out to a species-wide level. And, if we're talking about, again, healing, what does that mean on both an individual level? You can look at that from an epigenetic perspective. But then, of course, also, like we talked about the last show, on a multi-generational, species-wide level. And it's like you can look at what is the epigenetic state of both yourself and the entire species, right? And so this work is about beginning to make the small changes on a small time scale, just a human lifetime, that may translate to something many years down the road. And yeah, like you said, it being able to start to name, what you actually are feeling, where it shows up in your body, starts to create literacy, language for it, rather than it being something that's nebulous and, we're not actually able to work with. It's like, maybe some of your listeners have had the experience of feeling like they kind of know there's something wrong with their body, but not having a name for it, and then maybe getting some blood work done and going, oh, well, that makes so much sense. Now I have a name for it. I kind of know what to do. And it's the same thing with the things we're talking about with the psyche and the shadow work. It's like, depression or anxiety, like those things are just signposts that there are deeper things to really parse out and look at in a more granular way. And like depression, how does that relate to needs that aren't getting met? Or how does that relate to values that you're not living in alignment with? And being able to really specifically go in and name those and then make changes to come into more alignment with those things, is the path to healing and changing these larger epigenetic kind of structures and states. So yeah, I thank you so much for having this conversation. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this stuff.
I'm excited. I'm going to link your ebook on the show notes so people can have that and start working through this. And then, as always, if you start this work and you uncover something bigger or like a more overwhelming, then please reach out and find a practitioner that you can work with. And again, because you said earlier, this is all about you. To really do this work, you need a safe space. And so whether that's being with yourself, by yourself, in a quiet space, in a reflective, with something maybe not so deep and traumatic, but if you uncover something, please reach out and find a practitioner that you trust and that you know will help you create that safe space and help you sort of unpack, digest, and transmute some of these bigger issues for sure too. Awesome, David. Well, thank you so much. And I look forward to having you back. And then maybe, you know, we can, again, like delve, just keep peeling back the layers of the onion.
I love it. I love it. Let's plan for it. You know, these have been some of my favorite conversations I've ever had on a podcast. And it's just great to be able to explore these nooks and crannies and subtleties with all this.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much.